So when you design a study then, that pretty much dictates that you have to extract the materials in both a polar and a non-polar solvent. And then you can question, well, how long do I do the extraction for, and under what conditions? And the conditions that we talk about usually are temperature, duration of the extraction, in what solvent, and for how long, and at what temperature. Once you've done the extraction then, you've got these compounds that may have moved from that polymeric base into your extracting solvent, and then you have to go about beginning to look, if you will, to use analytical chemistry techniques to see what compounds moved, and if a compound did move, how much of it. So you have a number of different possible analytical techniques that you can use, and I'd like to step through those. So for instance, one common technique is what's called head-spaced gas chromatography with mass spectrometry detection. And the target of that technique focuses at very volatile chemicals. When you do extractions in solvents to get them ready for analysis, you usually have to volume reduce those solvents to get concentrations of the solvents down to a point where they're useful for the analytical technique. And when you do that, as you volume reduce, you can lose very volatile chemicals. So consequently, to not lose track of what those may happen, you use this head-spaced GCMS technique. And with the mass spec, you have the opportunity to identify a compound that you may see as a deflection on the chromatogram, and it's a quantitative technique. Another one is just gas chromatography with mass spectrometry, and in this case, you probably solvent exchange possibly or volume reduce that solvent, injected it into a gas chromatograph, and detected it using mass spectrometry. So again, with the mass spectral capability, you have an opportunity to identify what the structure is of the compound, and again, it's quantitative. Now, for compounds that don't lend themselves to gas chromatography, i.e. they're too polar, or they're too high molecular weight, or they're just not very volatile, we turn to liquid chromatography, high pressure liquid chromatography. And then again, we have to put a detector out on the end of it. So commonly what's used is ultraviolet detection, either in a diode array type of detector that detects multiple different wavelengths, or a fixed, usually low UV detector at somewhere around 230 nanometers. And then you can couple a mass spectrometer onto that. And the problem with liquid chromatography mass spectrometry is, unlike GC, where the mass fragmentation is well characterized and there's large libraries available to use to try and identify what the compounds are, this isn't so much true with LC mass spec. And again, unlike GC mass spec, where most everybody operates in a common fragmentation mode, electron impact usually, there's about four types of detection possibilities that you can run with LC mass spec. So it becomes a bit more complex. So can you identify it? Well, you do have mass spectrometry, so you have a chance, but the libraries aren't near as rigorous or as robust, but the technique is quantitative. For metals, all of the prior ones, prior analytical techniques go to organic compounds, but metals can leach also out of the compound. So we usually use inductive couplet plasma with a detector. At our facility, we use atomic emission spectroscopy, but there's also mass spectroscopy available. But in any case, there's a fixed number of metals, so you have a pretty good chance of getting identification of what the metals are, and the technique is quantitative. And then, generally, when you do the extraction, you kind of like to get an idea in a gross sense of what's the mass of material per mass extracted that's been taken out by a given solvent. So you might use a gravimetric residual, and then you kind of like to look and get an idea of what that major mass material is. And we use FTIR infrared for that. You can get at least a general category characterization of what those are, but it's usually not very quantitative. And then in addition to the elemental analysis, there's always the possibility, depending upon the situation that you have, that ions could migrate. So ion chromatography, usually focused on anion chromatography, because the ICP usually get a feeling for what the cations might be, outside of perhaps ammonium. But ion chromatography then can be used to identify ionic species that might migrate out. And again, it's pretty good likely by retention indices that you're going to know what the anion is that migrates, and it is quantity. But you can see there's quite an array of tests that need to be done to fairly fully categorize what extractables might come out. And each of the techniques have their own capabilities. So let's take a little example here where we do our extraction of our material. We've done the extraction and we've got some compounds that have been extracted out, either the polar solvent and the non-polar solvent, and we'll run those through, for instance, ion chromatography. And out of the polar column, maybe we see one ion, and out of the non-polar we don't, for the simple reason that the polar or the DI water, if you want to use it, would have more of a capacity to extract an ion. And then we run it through gas chromatography, and again, of the things that we have in the polar, maybe we see a couple of compounds out of the polar extract, and maybe 3 out of the non-polar extract. And you'll notice that the ion chromatography has no relationship at all to what you see by GC. So if you would have only run one of those, you would have seen what you saw by that one technique and missed other information. Liquid chromatography, again, if we run that, perhaps we get one compound out of the polar, similar to the same compound that we got by gas chromatography, but on the non-polar side, we get the same compound that we got by gas chromatography, but an additional compound. And then for the inductive coupled plasma, the ICP for the all-metal analysis, the metals analysis. Again, on the polar side, maybe we see one metal, maybe some counter-ion to the anion from the anion chromatography, and we see nothing from the by ion chromatography from the non-polar extraction. The point of all this is that if you don't run all of the different analytical techniques, you could miss some things, compounds or elements that could cause hazard to a person. So you have to, and you wouldn't have seen it if you only ran one technique, so you need to run them all. There's some guidances out there. There's no prescriptive, absolute, this is how you go about doing these testings. But there is some guidances out there. They're mostly founded in the ISO documents. The 10993 series, 18 is material characterization, 12 is biological evaluation. I'll talk a little more about that. 13 goes more to the polymerics, and 14 from ceramics. We're not going to focus much on ceramics. So in 10993.18, it takes you through this flow diagram, if you will, as to how you have to characterize your material. So if you know everything there is to know about your material and can guarantee that there's no risk introduced, you don't have to do anything. Chances are pretty good that you don't know everything. And it takes you through some steps, asks some questions, but basically it runs down and it says you have to run extractables testing to characterize your materials so that they can do a risk assessment as to what those extractables might cause for damage.